Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. Today I would like to talk about another potential presidential nominee for the Democratic Party in 2020, and this time we're talking about Tom Steyer, one of the major billionaire donors to the Democratic cause. Some people would probably want to compare him to Trump on a superficial basis since both are billionaires and donors to the party. However, I will point out that Tom Steyer is actually quite a bit different than Trump, and that those differences are important enough that they make him a fairly legitimate candidate, even if I wouldn't put him in the first tier of Democratic contenders. So without any further ado, let's look at who Tom Steyer is and what kind of impact he could have on the 2020 race if he does indeed decide to run. And by the way, the green font is because he is known for environmentalism and money. So this was my attempt to be clever. So the question for most of you is probably, who is Tom Steyer? Actually, I did not know myself prior to doing the research for this video. So let's look at Tom Steyer's basic resume. He's a 61-year-old billionaire hedge fund manager. So that means that he made his living in the financial industry, and that's something that a lot of the Democratic establishment would really put a lot of stock in. They have been trying to cozy up with bankers and hedge fund managers for years, and nominating one of them would be like a wet dream for many people who are fundraisers first and politicians second, the Nancy Pelosi's of the world. Despite his wealth, Steyer eschews luxury items, which makes him very different from Donald Trump, who of course has a golden toilet. And Steyer is deeply involved in the Episcopal Church. He converted in his late 30s, and this is something that he talks about a fair amount, not a lot. He's not as, say, overtly religious as a Jimmy Carter or a George W. Bush, but it's certainly there. Steyer sold his share in Farallon Capital in 2012 to focus on politics and environmental issues. So basically, he has been a professional political operative / donor since 2012. And that means he has quite a bit of experience in terms of knowing how the political system works and acting within it. He has a long personal history of activism within the Democratic Party that goes long before 2012, however. I believe at one point he worked on several campaigns. We'll get into those details in a bit. The main thing that he's known for right now is that he founded NextGen Climate, now called NextGen America, or NextGen American, excuse me. And this is a nonprofit organization that supports progressive policy positions on climate change, immigration, healthcare, and education. We'll look into the details of that later, but suffice it to say for now that the primary thing that Tom Steyer is known for issues-wise is being very strong on environmental issues. So let's get into his activities in a more specific way and look at what he's done. Due to the long-term involvement that Tom Steyer has had within the Democratic Party and the status among party leaders which comes from being a wealthy donor, I think that it's quite fair to label Tom Steyer as a Democratic insider. In 1984, he worked for Walter Mondale. Later on, he raised money for Bill Bradley in 2000, John Kerry in 2004, and Hillary Clinton in 2008, before then switching over to Obama and becoming one of his major fundraisers. He was a DNC delegate in 2004 and 2008, and he even spoke at the Democratic National Convention in 2012. So it can hardly be said that he has not been on the scene. He was actually in the running to be one of the candidates for Secretary of State in 2008. He apparently made the short list, and later when Obama needed a second Secretary of Energy, Tom Steyer was on the short list for that job as well in 2013. Tom's brother Jim said that Tom was pretty pissed off that he was not selected to be Secretary of the Treasury going into Obama's first term. Tom also flirted with a run for California's governor between 2015 and earlier this year, but he finally said that he had no intention of running. Perhaps that's because he's planning on running for president, or it's even possible that everyone has been misreading his intentions altogether and he has no interest in running for president. That's something that at this juncture is not clear, but for the purpose of this video, I'm going to assume that he is going to run for president. When people think of wealthy and prominent backers of the Democratic Party, The name that everyone knows is George Soros. However, Tom Steyer is probably at least as important as Soros, and maybe even a little more. In 2010, Steyer helped to push Proposition 23 in California, and he actually donated $5 million of his own money to the cause. It ended up being a losing effort. However, it can't be said that Steyer didn't try. In 2012, there was another proposition in California, Prop 39, and this was designed to close a loophole which allowed multi-state corporations to pay taxes out of state, so they could go to other states where they have lower tax rates and pay there, even if they did the majority of their business in California. Tom Steyer, who believes strongly in closing those loopholes, spent $29.6 million of his own money in a successful effort to end those tax loopholes. And predictably enough, he drew a lot of criticism for his outsized personal influence on this matter. Even in California, as wealthy a state as it is, someone spending nearly $30 million on a single issue will definitely have a huge impact on the outcome. In a 2013 special election for Massachusetts Senate seat after it was vacated, Steyer actually supported Democrat Ed Markey by spending $1.8 million as an outside advocate, and this ended up involving him hiring a plane to fly over the Boston Red Sox with a banner attacking Markey's opponent Steve Lynch by saying "Steve Lynch for Oil Evil Empire," which is not grammatically correct and sounds pretty weird. But, you know, when you're a billionaire, you have sensibilities that never get challenged properly, and you say and do weird things that a normal person would not. Steyer also spent $74 million during the 2014 election and $87 million in the 2016 cycle. So he is someone who is very willing to spend huge sums of money on his political objectives, and this has been his major way of participating in the political process up to this point. Tom Steyer is not the only left-leaning billionaire philanthropist, of course. There are others, and Tom Steyer is deeply connected with them and has worked with them in the past on many projects. In 2008, with a partner whose name I can't recall at the moment, Tom spent about $41 million to create a sustainable energy research group at Stanford University called Tomcat Center for Sustainable Energy. Of course, Tom is for Tom Steyer, and Cat would be for his partner. And this was designed to create a lighter, less toxic battery, and also to analyze the power grid's compatibility with future renewable technologies. I'm not sure exactly what results this research had. However, it's hard to criticize someone for spending money on scientific research. R&D is always a worthwhile venture. He also spent a lot of money on the Risky Business Project, where he helped fund it alongside of Michael Bloomberg and Henry Paulson. And basically, the goal of this group was to put a price tag on the economic risk of climate change. So a lot of people always say that we can't afford to combat climate change because it would be anti-business, but what Steyer, Bloomberg, and Paulson were trying to demonstrate is that not addressing climate change would actually be more expensive because of the ecological dangers that we would incur from climate change. So this is another project that I think is a very good idea, and he deserves credit for that. In 2015, he joined Bill Gates' Breakthrough Energy Coalition. This is an organization that's about jumpstarting demand and availability of green energy sources. I'm not really sure what impact this group has had, but in general, promoting green energy is a good idea, and it helps to both alleviate our carbon footprint and create a future where energy will be cheaper and we won't have to worry about fluctuations in things like oil markets. So it's altogether a good thing, and it's very clearly in line with Tom Steyer's main interest of environmental protection. Tom Steyer is best known for the group that he supervises most directly, NextGen America. In 2013, he founded this group as NextGen Climate. It's a political action committee, but as its issues evolved and broadened, it became NextGen America, since climate didn't quite encompass everything that it stood for. Steyer's PAC and support gave money and influence to the environmental movement. So NextGen Climate and NextGen America have really revitalized the power of the environmental movement in America. Of course, we've already seen the power that it exerted in California, but it's starting to have that impact nationwide. This group has sent people out across the country to raise awareness, support, and fundraising for climate-based issues. Tom Steyer gained a little bit of fame for arguing with Obama, who of course he supported and raised money for, over the Keystone XL pipeline. And he even appeared at a rally against the pipeline in Washington, D.C., where he spoke on the issue. So this might be an interesting dynamic, the idea that Tom Steyer actually sparred with Obama over environmental issues and he was pushing him to the left. When we usually think of billionaire donors, we think of them pushing to the right because they usually want to make sure that their own businesses are well taken care of, even if they're generally more liberal. So tech companies might be socially liberal, but when it comes to, say, their own taxes, they tend to be pretty damn conservative. Or when it comes to regulating them, they're totally opposed to it. However, in this case, Tom Steyer, who has now retired and has no real interest in, say, protecting Exxon's bottom line from regulation, can clearly go and be sort of legitimate on this issue. In 2015, as the 2016 process was really heating up and we were beginning to get a feel for who was in the field, Tom Steyer called on the 2016 candidates to develop a strategy for moving the U.S. to a 50% clean energy grid by 2030. And because at this point everyone assumed that Hillary Clinton had it in the bag and that it was a coronation, not a primary, it's pretty obvious that he was aiming this message directly at her. And since he had done a good job raising money for her in 2008, and it's known that he's one of the premier fundraisers in the Democratic Party, this is something that someone like a Hillary Clinton would have to take very seriously. Since if she were to really offend Tom Steyer, she would be devoid of money. And with her general lack of charisma and political talent, if she can't outspend someone, she is dead on arrival. The one action that Tom Steyer has performed which really put his name into the Democratic field for 2020 was when he funded and led the need to impeach. In October of 2017, Steyer spent $10 million of his own dollars and appeared as a concerned citizen in an ad calling for Congress to impeach Donald Trump. Now, Nancy Pelosi was really angry with Steyer for this move since she and the Democratic leadership had given up on the cause of impeachment. After all, if you don't control Congress, it's very hard to impeach. And given the lack of evidence the Democrats had over, say, Russian collusion, impeachment at that time especially seemed like a forlorn cause. So Steyer defied Democratic leadership and went out on his own and ran this ad. What I would say, though, is that this political stunt really reveals the good and bad qualities of Steyer as a potential candidate. On the one hand, he's clearly independent-minded. He is not necessarily a creature of the Democratic Party, despite the fact that he supports them. He does what he thinks is right. And I think that that is something that appeals to people. People tend to like candidates who are chaotic good, especially if you are on the Democratic side. However, the main problem here is that Steyer doesn't seem to understand his place in the space-time continuum very clearly. He can't ever really just be a concerned citizen because he's a billionaire. He has more power than your average person. He can influence propositions in California or political races anywhere in the country. He can afford to have planes fly over the Red Sox stadium, as we've talked about. And if you can afford to do that, you're not just some regular citizen. And no one would accept his claim to be just that. So I think that by making himself out to be a regular guy, he would come across as dishonest. A lot of Republicans have managed to get away with that over the years, but for Democrats, the standards are simply different. George W. Bush can claim to be just a normal guy who likes Budweiser or whatever non-alcoholic beverage he has to drink now, but a Democrat doing it would come across as disingenuous and ridiculous. So, the other thing, of course, is the whole money and politics issue, which we're going to address in more detail. But for now, just take the idea that Tom Steyer's self-perception and then the way that other people will perceive him seem to be a bit out of alignment, and that can be fatal in a political race. Just like Hillary Clinton thought that running a personality-centered campaign might not be a bad idea because she couldn't accept the idea that people don't like her and that she's inherently unlikable. I see a similar lack of political instinct and self-awareness in Tom Steyer. But again, I might just be reading a little bit too much into this particular stunt. However, this is really all we have to go on, given that he's never run for office at this point. So, jury's still out on whether he has political instincts or not, but I'm sort of leaning toward the idea that he might not. Let's take a look at Tom Steyer's known political stances and talk about how they would play out politically. So we don't really know what his political instincts are like, because he's never run for office before. It's hard to say, and a few of his stunts indicate that maybe he doesn't quite have the best political instincts. Like the airplane for Ed Markey was a little bit ridiculous. Anyway, two things that he has going for him that would help him massively in a Democratic primary and probably more, a decent amount in a general election. He's a strong advocate of alternative energy, and he's a strong advocate of environmental protection. A lot of people are really waking up to the idea that alternative energy in the long run saves you money on your bills, so even Republicans who don't care that much about environmental protection could get behind this, I think. In terms of environmental protection, people are turning more and more toward it, especially in the wake of things like what happened in Flint with the water. People understand the need to protect their water sources. So those things are both positive. When it comes to his stance on taxes, this is another thing that could help him very much. Most people, including most Republicans, or at least a decent amount of Republicans, are pretty much aware of the fact that the wealthy should pay more in taxes than people who are poor. And Tom Steyer took a pretty strong stance in 2017 against Trump's tax plan by labeling it a thinly veiled reverse Robin Hood. Remember, most Democrats didn't really do a hell of a lot to oppose this tax plan, so this is another time when Tom Steyer appeared stronger than the Nancy Pelosi's and Chuck Schumer's of the world. If we look at the stances that his organization, NextGen America, which is basically, again, just the institutionalized version of Tom Steyer's person, what we see is that there are a few different stances that most likely reflect what Tom Steyer would run on. And even if he chose to run in a different way, the fact that his organization has taken these stances means that there's no way he could distance himself from these stances. So they want to create a path to citizenship for immigrants. That's something that is pretty mainstream. I don't really know if it will help or hinder him. It's hard to say. Immigration's a pretty thorny issue when it comes to how people react to it. There's a certain emotion attached to the issue of immigration that most other issues don't have. I think overall it would help him a little bit, but I don't know if it would have a big impact politically. And it's also not going to be anything different than what other Democrats would run on. So let's call that one a wash. The right to join unions, this is something that the Democratic Party is turning more toward, at least the progressive side of it. And this would make Tom Steyer appeal more to progressives within the party. So I think this would be a positive. This is also something that I think more and more people are waking up to as something that the country needs to embrace as a way to deal with inequality and stagnant wages. So this would be a positive. The one stance that NextGen America has taken, which is really milquetoast, corporatist, and pathetic, is the idea of affordable health care. This is basically just let's defend Obamacare and not do anything more progressive than that. And the problem with this stance is that it is supposed to appeal to moderate Republicans. The problem is, at this point, a majority of Americans of all political stripes are in favor of Medicare for all or some kind of a single-payer system. So there is no benefit to be derived from running in favor of quote affordable health care. This is a nonsensical position at this point, given that most Americans favor a single payer system. Not only that, but if you are someone who's concerned with which policies are best for the country, data shows that single payer healthcare provides the best service for the most amount of people, and it also would save money in the long run as opposed to our current corporate welfare slash healthcare system. So, this is a stance that could allow him to be open to a heavy attack on the left flank from people like Bernie Sanders, who are much stronger on the issue of healthcare. So now that we've looked at Tom Steyer's life and his stances, I would like to see what his sources of appeal would be in a primary election. So in terms of his personal character and his contributions to society, Tom Steyer is a very different kind of billionaire than Donald Trump. So whereas Donald Trump comes across as someone who's ungrateful and someone who is completely self-serving, doesn't care about society as a whole, you can't really say that about Tom Steyer, even if you don't like billionaires. He clearly does care about the world. You might disagree with him, but clearly the guy has made an effort to improve the world around him. He's also knowledgeable about policies that he favors, and he is very dedicated to his favorite causes. The fact that he is personally not all that famous, yet still very prominent and very active, means that he seems to care more about the causes he stands for than about promoting his brand. So it's pretty hard to find a billionaire more different than Donald Trump than Tom Steyer. He's also uniquely strong in environmental issues. So if, say, we were to have a major environmental crisis over the next couple years leading into the primary cycle, then that might play right into Tom Steyer's hands because this is his signature issue. I can't really think of anyone in the field who has done more or associated himself more with the environment than Tom Steyer. For the establishment, I think Tom Steyer would seem like a safe and good pick. Now, as I mentioned, he did show an independent streak they wouldn't like, and he has had some beef with Pelosi. He had a slight disagreement with Obama over the Keystone XL pipeline. However, since the establishment at least is smart enough to know that there is an anti-establishment bias, they could, say, put him up as someone who would really go along with most of what they want to do, but has sort of a mavericky streak in him a la John McCain. So the reasons why he would appeal to the establishment and seem safe is because he doesn't have any hard specifics on economic issues. And that's something that you see for all establishment candidates. Look at Cory Booker. What does he want the minimum wage to be? What's the number? We don't know. How does he want to strengthen unions if he does at all? Well, we don't know. And you can say the same thing for Tom Steyer. So for that reason, the establishment has always been very cautious about putting specific numbers and policies on their issues because they want to appeal to corporate donors and moderate Republicans. And Tom Steyer kind of fits that bill pretty well. He also has not endorsed universal health care, and the official establishment Democratic position is to defend the ACA rather than to go to a Medicare for all position. And in that regard, Tom Steyer also fits the bill. So, because he is very progressive on environmental and social issues, he could be someone who has some cross appeal with progressives, but does not offend the establishment. So the establishment could back Tom Steyer as a sort of compromise candidate who basically does what they want, but doesn't completely offend the sensibilities of progressives the way that Cory Booker does. Tom Steyer is also known as a man of action, rather than someone who is just a man of words. And while some of his actions clearly are questionable, the thing is, people in general tend to value people who put their money where their mouth is. They tend to value action over rhetoric. And in a time when so many people in the neoliberal era are all talk and no action, someone like Tom Steyer, who isn't afraid to take action, has a certain amount of appeal. So I think that these are the things that could potentially make Tom Steyer a player. But now let's look at the major downsides to running someone like a Tom Steyer. Tom Steyer, as a candidate, has some definite sources of appeal, but his weaknesses, I would argue, are even stronger. Let's take a look at Citizens United. Now, most Democrats, including establishment people like Cory Booker and Hillary Clinton, are opposed to Citizens United, a 2010 Supreme Court ruling which really lifted the caps on spending by moneyed interest in American politics. The thing is, even with those caps in place prior to 2010, no one is really at this point under the illusion that America was free from corporate domination. In the 1970s, Supreme Court rulings at that time let the floodgates open, and the 80s, 90s, and 2000s were completely corporate when it comes to our politics. The 2010s have been much the same, and it hasn't really changed that much, despite the fact that there's been more corporate cash, because we already were in a corporatocracy. Steyer, predictably, being a Democratic activist, is also opposed to Citizens United. However, he says that even though he opposes money in politics, certain issues can't wait. And while that is part of his appeal as a man of action rather than a man of rhetoric, it also makes him part of the problem. He is someone who has used his personal outsized influence to affect policy, the same way that the Koch brothers have. Now, you might argue, if you're a Democrat, that Tom Steyer's impact has been much more positive. And while I would agree with that personally, the fact is that we should not have individuals with that much power in a democratic society. It is incompatible with the idea of a liberal democracy in the modern era. And I think that this extraordinary personal influence won't appeal to most progressive voters and even a lot of less progressive Democrats in a primary. It just doesn't seem right. His hedge fund background, while I think that it will appeal to the establishment, will also be a bit of an impediment when it comes to progressive voters. If you're someone who supports a Bernie Sanders-like figure, I can't see someone like that switching their support to Tom Steyer, given that Steyer was a Wall Street guy for most of his life. And it's also possible that due to his hedge fund background, when he's pressed on issues of how to regulate the financial industry, he might be a laissez-faire guy. And that will not fly with a Democratic base, at least not a substantial portion of it. Also, we've already seen what happens when a major party donor takes over the party. The Trump presidency provides ample evidence of that. And while Steyer is clearly much more intelligent and thoughtful than Donald Trump, I don't think that a lot of people in the Democratic Party would be willing to vote to do the experiment that the Republicans did by changing out the puppet for the puppet master. It would be very easy to campaign against Tom Steyer just on that issue alone, or on the fact that this guy has used his personal money to act as a substitute for his argumentation. And if he did get nominated, then the lines of attack for the Republicans are pretty damn obvious and easy. They could talk about him flying that plane over the Red Sox stadium. I'm sure that that would be an ad by itself. His involvement in California politics, that would be another series of ads by itself. They could also say that what the Democrats have been saying about Trump being a spoiled billionaire is now negated. You couldn't run against Trump's foibles and his billionaire status anymore because you would be running someone with probably more money than Donald Trump. So Steyer, as a nominee, would have to give up some of the lines of attack that any other Democrat could use. And for that reason, I don't think that he's as strong as a candidate as many other people in the field. I don't think he has a clear path through the primary. He does have some friction with the establishment, as we talked about, even though he's basically an establishment guy. And he is not strong enough on issues of economics to really be a champion for the progressive wing. So his path is a little less clear than most other candidates. And for that reason, I just don't think that he will end up being the Democratic nominee in 2020. If he were to be nominated somehow, though, I bet he could probably stand a decent chance of beating Trump. However, the problem for Steyer is, once again, I have plenty of doubts about his political instincts, and he has some major liabilities. In conclusion, I don't regard Tom Steyer as being a first-tier candidate. He's not on the same level as a Gillibrand, Joe Biden, or a Bernie Sanders. However, he is not someone to be completely written off. He does seem to be genuine on environmental issues, and he has money, connections, and clout. He can definitely get his message out there, even if no one wants him to get it out. He has the personal resources to make sure that his message will be heard by a large number of people. He can personally buy airtime in any market in America. And he also has an organization set up, NextGen America, which could pretty much be turned into a Tom Steyer presidential campaign. Now, legality aside, he still has the resources to do something like that and to make sure that the paperwork goes through. So, I don't think he could win a Democratic primary for the reasons I laid out just now. However, in a 2020 field, someone like a Tom Steyer would definitely stand out, and I think that he could have an impact on the shape of the race, even if he can't actually win that race. And I don't really know what that impact would be. At the bare minimum, I think he would definitely push the envelope on environmental issues. He could make environmentalism one of, if not the key issue in the race. And for that reason alone, he might just enter the field. But I also don't really know who his candidacy would impact the most. Would he squeeze out the establishment guys more, or would he squeeze out the progressives more? How would the media treat Steyer? Who would not be able to get any shine because of Steyer? I simply don't know the answer to that. But what I can predict with confidence is that if he does run, it will have an impact on the race. This guy has a lot of personal gravity. But even despite that, I just don't think he can win, barring a major environmental catastrophe between now and the election that makes someone like a Tom Steyer seem like a desirable and apt candidate. So those are my thoughts on Tom Steyer. I also don't know for sure if he'll run, but if he does run, these are my predictions for how that run would play out. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.